Hey guys and gals, today we're going to talk to you about post-Civil War American society. We're going to take a brief look at what it was like just immediately after the Civil War and see kind of what it was like for the people living at that period of time. So without further ado, let's get started. Now, when we think about the end of the Civil War, it was for millions of people a confrontation with death on a scale to which they'd never really seen, never really been a part of, never really experienced before in their lives. And in this case, many of them would never see again. The number of soldiers who died between 1861 and 1865 is estimated at roughly 620,000. Now, that's a lot, because if you take the total number of American fatalities in the American Revolution, the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, World War I, World War II, and the Korean War combined, you still don't come up with 620,000. Now, interestingly enough, it is a huge number, but that's just the number of battle fatalities, the number of war casualties. That does not take into account the number of civilian deaths. And only recently have we tried to get a grip on that number. But because the Graves Service, which is the one that records all of these deaths, was so new at the time, it was the first time it had ever been employed, ever been used. And so you have a kind of inaccurate count. But when you add to that 620,000 the number of civilian dead, you get a total closer to 700,000. And so when we look at it, a fatality rate like that, a similar death rate of about 2%, which is what we have in the American Civil War. If you look at just the base number, 620,000, that's somewhere around 6 million today. If you add to that all of the civilian casualties, which have been a topic of late, you get roughly today what would be 7 million casualties, and so that is it's a staggering number by any stretch, certainly, but it is something that does separate this war certainly from other wars in at least in our recent past up to this point. Now, when we look at the war itself, in 1865, it's still possible as late as 1865 for the South to win their version of victory over the North. They can at least pull something out, and so they've still they haven't made the North hasn't made its march to the sea. Sherman hasn't gotten his march to the sea yet, and the Confederate capital still stands. The Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia, still stands, and so the opportunities are there. But Richmond will fall to Union forces on April 5th, 1865, and as such, it will be shelled into absolute submission. And so, reporters begin to report that you can finally think of the United States as an old country because we have ruins. I don't know that that's necessarily the thing we're not really that old of a country, but because most of the South is in an absolute shambles, because it has been shelled into submission in many places, and many cities have been destroyed by Union cannon fire and whatnot, you do have a country of ruins. And so in some sense, the reporters are right. We do have an old country now because we do have ruins. Interestingly enough, Lee and Grant, the leaders of the two armies here, will meet at the McLean House in Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, to discuss the terms of the South's surrender. And this is an interesting thing about that particular little piece of information. Wilmer McLean is a person who he tried his best to stay out of the war. Now, the house in the black and white picture is the first house that Wilmer McLean lives in. And that is in Manassas, or what we would call Bull Run. At the first Battle of Bull Run, the very first battle of the Civil War, he is asked by P.G.T. Beauregard and other Southerners to use his home as a headquarters to set up a staging ground to fight this battle. And so he packs up his family and his belongings, and he moves them far, far away to a place he believes will not be touched by the war, a dusty little crossroad in the middle of nowhere named Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, and that is the color photo on the other side. Interestingly enough, by the end of the war, Wilmer McLean will be the only person in American history to be able to say that the Civil War started in my front yard and ended in my front parlor. So try as he may, try as he might to escape the horrors of war, they will come to his doorstep, literally. But that is another interesting little factoid about the Civil War and certainly about Wilmer McLean. But they will meet at the McLean House to basically deal with the surrender terms and deal with the Army of Northern Virginia. And just how do they do that? Well, let's take a look. Now, interestingly enough, Union forces, when they get to Appomattox Courthouse, will begin setting up printing presses in a tavern, and they'll crank out roughly 25 to 30,000 of these parole slips, like you see here. Now, what they're going to do is they're basically going to give these parole slips out to all the Confederate soldiers under Lee's command. And what they say is nothing political. In fact, they're incredibly simple. They're incredibly apolitical, and they're some of the last orders that Lincoln himself will give. And interestingly enough, when you read it, this basically tells them to go home to the bearer of whatever company, whatever regiment. A paroled prisoner of the Army of Northern Virginia has permission to go to his home and there remain undisturbed. Go home. Now, interestingly enough, they're not just going to go home. Confederate soldiers had to give up their rifles, but they got to keep their sidearms, yay for them, and their horses if they had them. Other than that, they were told simply to go home. So keep your sidearms, keep your horses. We'll feed both of you, and we'll send you on your way. And that is the surrender. It's pretty simple, right? Pretty basic. Only Lee was taken into custody following Appomattox. His custody allowed him to ride his horse to Richmond or wherever he pleased, and then there stay. He would be placed under house arrest for a short period of time and then eventually let go. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, would be charged but never tried. Alexander Stephens, his Confederate vice president, would be charged with war crimes but never tried. Only the commandant of Andersonville Prison, Wirtz, and this is the guy, Captain Henry Wirtz, he is the only person who will be tried for war crimes and found guilty and hung as a result. The only person in the American Civil War that this happens to. So again, another unique person in our Civil War history, Captain Henry Wirtz. What was it like for most Southerners during this period of time? Of course, a lot of Southerners are going to have a lot to say about the surrender, right? Southerners, of course, respond through various diary entries from the time period, titling it either the day or the surrender, right? The day we heard, sometimes the day or the surrender. Kate Stone, who is a great diarist of this period of time, and she's going to write extensively in her diary about the Civil War and the different goings-on of it. She wrote, "All are fearfully depressed. I cannot bear to hear them talk of defeat. Conquered, submission, subjugation are the words in my heart." Wow, that seems, it seems you're pretty down, right? Ooh, man, whoosh. Now, fast forward to a couple of weeks later, and she is going to have an entirely different tune. Going to be singing an entirely different tune. It sounds quite upbeat, but it's over a whole other event, the assassination of President Lincoln. She says, "Thank you, John Wilkes Booth, for, quote unquote, ridding the world of a tyrant. We are glad he is not alive, to rejoice in our humiliation and insult us with his jokes. Now, when you look at Southern Diary entries from this time period, a lot of them echo very similar sentiments. They're very downtrodden, beaten down, depressed about the whole situation with the surrender of the Confederate Army. And then, of course, a couple of weeks later, they're jubilant and, oh, thank you, John Wilkes Booth, for doing that. I don't think they understood really how lucky they were to be in the position that they were in. So, what are you going to do? Now, not everybody was excited about Lincoln's assassination. That summer, and that spring and summer, an estimated 8,000 to 10,000 ex-Confederates, many of them former high-ranking Confederate officers, would flee the country because they still weren't sure that maybe Congress wasn't going to come after them, probably. Many of them ended up going to Brazil, England, Mexico, Canada, and some of them even as far away as Japan. Most of them will never return to the United States, interestingly enough. And so you have this sort of mass exodus going on in the wake of the end of the Civil War, of course, Lincoln's assassination, and these high-ranking Confederate officers getting out of the country as fast as they possibly can. Now, when we look at the war itself, there's a lot to really take in. What has the war accomplished for us? What has it done? Well, there's a couple of things. There's 4 basic things that the war accomplishes for us, and I think things that we can really probably get behind. Now, number 1, secession is done away with almost completely. We do away with, now occasionally you hear somebody like California say, oh, we're going to secede from the Union, or people in Texas sometimes say, we're Texas, man, we're a republic way before this thing ever was anything, and so we could secede. I'm here to tell you, no, you don't want to secede. You got to have your own currency, your own army. You got to come up with your own government. You're not going to be able to fall back on any sort of federal support from the United States federal government, and now you're open to attack from everybody because you're your own entity. You've broken ties with the United States. So secession itself, bad idea. Don't ever do it. But secession is done away with almost completely at the end of the American Civil War. The second thing, when you look at the U.S. Constitution, it's going to undergo a lot of changes, especially during Reconstruction. 11 of the first 12 amendments to the Constitution have been written to limit the power of the federal government. 6 of the next 7 amendments will be written to increase the power of the federal government, and it will do so in ways that it never has up to this point. It will change the government of the United States, and it will change the relationship of the government to its people. And then number 3, power will shift from the South to the North, at least for a little while. And in that short period of time, the North, with the Southerners out of the way, in other words, they haven't come back into Congress yet, with the Southerners out of the way, they're able to pass all sorts of legislation. Homestead Act of 1862, the Morrill Land-Grant Colleges Act, 1864, I think it is. There's a whole bunch of different things that they get passed that they couldn't get past before, and now they're able to. So that's always nice. And then, of course, the last thing, the Nativist Party, the Know-Nothings of the American Party, whatever you want to call them, they are going to be put away for a little while, or put on the run for a little while, depending on how you look at it. The influence of the nativists over issues like immigration and things like that is going to be something that is nil during this period. So you have that going on. So those are your 4 major things that are going to happen. But stay tuned, because next time we're going to talk to you about presidential reconstruction, and that is something you don't want to miss. Thanks for coming by. Give me a like. If you like me enough, subscribe, and thank you again for watching.